We all know that canvas material makes great pillowcases, pencil pouches, and tote bags. But today I'm using it to sew a vest. I'm using Simplicity 1499 to sew this easy wardrobe layering piece. This pattern also offers variations where you could sew on a diagonal zipper in the front and a button tab in the back. So you can follow today's tutorial to sew the entire vest. Both of those features can be top stitched onto the garment afterward. The fabric that I'm using today is a White Swan canvas by Bonnie and Buttermilk. Bonnie and Buttermilk specialize in happy statement fabrics. I've left a link to the fabric and to the pattern below so you can check out all the details. I hope you sew along with me today. Let's get started. Before I begin attaching my pockets to the bodice pieces, I want to finish the edges of the pockets all the way around for both pocket sets. I'm also going to finish the inner edges of both of my side front pieces, as well as the inner edges of two of my front pieces. Now with right sides together, I'll place one pocket along the inner edge of the side front piece, matching my dots and notches and pin in place. And I'll do the same to match the corresponding pocket to the corresponding front piece. Once again, matching my dots and notches and pinning in place. Then I'll take these to the sewing machine and sew the pockets in place from top to bottom with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I'll repeat this for the remaining front and side front pieces. Then take these pieces to the ironing board and press those pockets out and over their seam allowances. Then we can place those corresponding front and side front pieces right sides together and pin those princess seams from top to bottom, matching your notches. On the wrong side of the fabric, you have transfer dots indicating where we're going to be stopping and starting the stitching around the pocket opening. We're going to sew from the top of the bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance until we get to the first dot and backstitch to secure. Then we're going to start a fresh set of stitches at the next dot, again backstitching to secure, sewing to the bottom of the garment. Do this for both sets of front and side front pieces. Now that those princess seams are sewn, we can pin the outer edges of the pockets. And with those main seam allowances moved out of the way, on the front and the back side of the pocket, we're going to sew from the dots that we just started and stopped our stitches at, sewing those pocket bags together all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. From dot to dot, doing this to sew both sets of pockets. And once those pockets are sewn together, you can open out that main seam. You can press those seam allowances open with the pocket facing toward the front piece. Here are both of my back bodice pieces. Before I sew these pieces together, I'm going to finish those center back seams separately. Now we can place our back pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam, matching your notches. Sew this center back seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seam open. Before I attach the front and back bodice pieces, I want to finish the shoulder seams and the side seams on both sides of the back bodice piece, as well as the shoulder and side seams for both front bodice pieces. Now that the raw edges of my shoulder and side seams are finished, I'm going to place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin their shoulder and side seams together, matching the notches. And then go to your sewing machine and sew both of your shoulders and both of your side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of one of your collar pieces. Then we're going to take it to the sewing machine, and with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew along the bottom notched edge of the collar from one side to the other. Along this notched edge that we just stitched, we also have dots indicating where we're going to be clipping to the stitching line. Using sharp scissors, clip to both of your dots to but not through your stitching line. And then take this center section to the ironing board and press it up to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch, right along that stitching line. Now place both of your collar pieces right sides together and pin your top and side edges, leaving those bottom notched edges open. Sew the side and top edges of the collar together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim your seams and your corners, and then turn your collar right side out, poking out your corners. And give those collar seams a good press. Now place the long unfolded edge of the collar right sides together with the top of your bodice, right along the neckline, and pin in place, matching your dots and your notches. Now we're going to baste the collar to the neckline as pinned from one side of the collar to the other. We're going to baste with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and when we get to that center section where one side of the collar is pressed to the inside, we're going to continue stitching across through that one layer of the collar, careful not to catch the opposite edge of the collar in your stitching. Here is the bottom-most edge of my bodice. Before I start working on and attaching the facing, I've gone ahead and pressed up my hem edges to make it easier to hem the garment later. I've folded and pressed the entire hem to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch, and additionally I pressed the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of both of your remaining front pieces. Now for the facing, I'm going to finish the shoulder seams and the long inner edge for both pieces separately. Then I've pressed those finished edges to the wrong side by about 1/4 of an inch for those inner seams and the shoulder seams, doing this for both facing pieces. Now I'm going to take both of these pieces to the sewing machine and edge stitch those folded edges along the inner serged edge from the bottom to the top and along the shoulder seam. Now place your facing right sides together with the top edge of your bodice, and we're going to pin it in place along the top edge, sandwiching the collar in between. Also pin that center front seam and the bottom edge, making sure those bottom pre-pressed creases are opened out for now. Do this on both sides of the bodice for both facing pieces. We're going to start sewing the facing to the bodice along the very bottom edge, from that inner folded edge of the facing to the corner of the garment. We're going to sew these bottom sections with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. And once we get to that center front corner, we're going to pivot our stitching and continue stitching with a 5/8 inch seam allowance for the remainder of the garment, pivoting once again at the top to stitch across the collar section, again being careful not to catch that inner folded edge of the collar as you go, and stitching back down the opposite center front until you get to that bottom corner edge once again, pivoting your stitching to finish stitching that facing with a 3/4 inch seam allowance once again along this bottom edge. Now that those facings are attached, we can clip the corners and also clip into the curves of the neckline without clipping through the stitching line. Also, along the neckline at each finished edge of the facing, we want to clip to the seam line to free up this seam allowance to be tucked under that open edge of the collar. Now we can turn our facings right side out, poking out the corners, And then take the garment to your ironing board and press all of those facing seams, also pressing that exposed seam allowance at the neckline, up and underneath that open edge of the collar. Now using a needle and thread, I'm going to slip stitch this opening in the collar, stitching that bottom folded edge of the collar to the bodice from one side of the opening to the other. I'm also going to hand stitch the finished edges of the facing to the shoulder seams on both sides. Now for the bottom edge of the garment, you can fold along your pre-pressed lines, folding up that 3/4 of an inch and tucking under that 1/4 inch at the top, and pin in place all the way across. Now we're going to top stitch the entire outer edges of the garment with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Starting a 1/2 inch in from the bottom center edge, we're going to sew across the bottom with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, catching that inner folded edge of the bottom hem. And when we get to the opposite center front, we're going to pivot our stitching to continue sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pivoting around those corners of the collar, continuing all across the collar, pivoting once again until you're down where you started your stitching. To bind the armholes, the pattern calls for 1/2 inch wide single fold bias tape. I'm going to press one short edge of the bias tape to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch and place this folded edge at the underarm seam. With right sides together and the raw edge of the bias tape 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the armhole, I'm going to pin it in place all the way around. Once that's pinned and your bias tape is back where you started, allow the loose end of the bias tape to overlap the folded edge by about 3/4 of an inch and trim off the excess. And pin in place. Now we're going to sew the bias tape all around the armhole with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that bias tape is attached, we're essentially going to wrap this raw edge of the armhole. We're going to turn the bias tape to the inside of the garment, tucking the raw edge of the bias tape underneath. So now we have a nice crisp seam line and a clean bias tape tucked into the inside and pin in place. Continue turning and pinning that bias tape all the way around. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to the inner fold of the bias tape all the way around, repeating all of these steps to attach the bias tape to the opposite armhole. Give everything a nice final press and your vest is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.